By the third night of the black frost, Blackwillow Fold had disappeared. Wind drove across Knifegrass Basin at more than 50 miles an hour. The cold had fallen to 48 below. Snow buried the corrals and rubbed out the line between the ground and the sky. At the north wall, one lashing on the willow brake tore loose. Merritt Vane knotted a rope around his waist and set the other end in Lenora Quill's hands. If the brake gave way, the wind would swing against the barn and pour back through the calf pens. Inside, Tobin counted the pulls on the rope. Maisie slept behind a blue canvas curtain. Clay Pritch, the man who had laughed at every stake Merritt drove into the ground, lay half frozen beside the stove. A cow strained in early labor, and a calf lay still in the straw. The rope jerked once, then nothing. 6 weeks earlier, Merritt had reached this ranch asking only for a little milk for his children. How had a hungry stranger's bargain become the one thing standing between the whole place and the deadliest cold of the winter? Late in November of 1886, Merritt Vane reached Blackwillow Fold with an old handcart, 2 children, and less food than the 3 of them needed for one more day. The snow was not deep yet. It lay in the grass like salt, thin enough that the cart wheels found the ruts beneath it and held them. Merritt leaned into the crossbar and walked. He had walked most of 30 miles since Medora, and the fingers of his left hand had stopped closing an hour back, so he hooked his wrist over the bar and let the good hand steer. Maisie rode in the cart under a heavy blue canvas. She was 3. She had stopped asking when they would eat, which was worse than the asking. Tobin walked at the wheel. He was 9, and thin the way a boy gets when he has learned to give food away and call himself full. That morning, Tobin had broken the last biscuit in 2 and slid 1/2 up his sleeve. He thought Merritt had not seen. Merritt had seen. He said nothing, because there was nothing he could put in the boy's sleeve that would answer the fear that put it there. He had passed a spread the day before, where he once asked for paid work and been turned back at the gate. He did not stop there again. A man could ask for wages and be refused, and still be a man. A man who begged twice at the same gate became something else. Merritt had decided a long way back that he would trade for what his children ate, or he would go without them watching, but he would not beg. The strap that held Maisie's blanket rolled to the cart was waxed leather, stitched from 2 broken harness traces. His wife had made it. Elva had a way of joining leather that did not come apart, and it had not, through 3 years and a great many miles. He checked the buckle without thinking, the way he checked it a dozen times a day. He came over the last low rise and saw the ranch below him in the blue end of the afternoon. A long single-wall barn, a house grown up around an older sod kitchen, 2 corrals, a hay shed with a sag in its north roof. Smoke stood off the chimney, and outside a milkhouse door, on a bench, sat a covered pail with steam leaking from under the lid. Milk. Merritt did not go toward the house. He set the cart down and went toward the barn. He walked the north side of it slowly, reading it the way another man might read a letter. Wisps of wool had caught on the boards where cattle had rubbed, and the wool lay flat and pointing south, which told him the wind came hard off the north wall and found the gaps in it. He put his face close to a crack between 2 boards and felt cold breathe out of it, and inside the crack, on the sheltered edge, he saw a rind of frost. Frost on the inside of a wall, showing from the outside. That meant warm, wet air was leaving the barn all day and all night, carrying the animals' heat out with it. He was still standing there, one eye to the crack, when the dogs began, and a woman came around the corner of the barn with an axe held low and easy in both hands. "You've been looking at my barn a long while," Lenora Quill said, "for a man who hasn't knocked." She did not raise the axe, and she did not lower her eyes. She was 36, though the cold and the year had put more than that on her face. She had heard the dogs, taken the axe off the porch nail, and come out to see what wanted her attention. She had buried a husband 18 months back and run the place alone since, and she had learned to meet a stranger square. Merritt stepped back from the wall and took his cap off with the hand that worked. "I have 2 children in that cart," he said. "I'd rather talk to you about your barn than about them, but I'll do it in whatever order you like." She looked past him at the cart, at the blue canvas, at the boy standing very still at the wheel with his eyes on her axe. She looked back at Merritt. "Milk first," she said. "Then we'll see about the barn." She set the axe head down against the boards, went into the milk house, and came out with the steaming pail. She poured for Maisie first into a tin cup and put it into the child's 2 hands and watched to see that the small hands held it. Then she poured for Tobin. Only when both children were drinking did she straighten and look at the man again. "Now," Lenora said, "say your piece." Merritt said it plainly because a plain thing did not sound like begging. "Feed my children milk through January," he said. "Give us the tack room floor to sleep on. I'll fix what the north wind is about to take from you. I ask no wages until a calf lives through a hard freeze under a roof I've worked on. You can turn me out after 7 days if I can't show you something you can measure." Lenora did not answer that. She turned instead and looked at her own barn, the way you look at a thing when a stranger has just told you it is sick. "You've seen the outside of it for 10 minutes, she said. "Tell me what's wrong with the inside, without going in." "The calving corner is colder than the center aisle," Merritt said. "There are lines of clear board along the north wall where the snow's melted off in stripes. That's warm air leaving through the joints, and it leaves fastest where the animals crowd. Your heat is walking out the wall." Lenora's jaw moved. She picked the axe back up, not as a threat now, but as a thing to carry, and jerked her head toward the door. "Come see how close you got," she said. Inside, the barn was dim and smelled of cattle and old hay. Merritt walked the north wall to the calving corner and put the back of his good hand near the boards, and the cold came off them. He was right about the corner. He said so, and she did not argue. But he had missed a thing, and she found it before he did. She crouched, pushed the thin straw aside with the axe handle, and put her palm flat to the ground along the base of the wall. When she took the hand away, it was dark and wet to the wrist. "The sill's wet," Lenora said. "It's been wet a while. You were looking at the air. You didn't look at the ground." "No," Merritt said. "I didn't." He crouched beside her and looked at what she had found, and did not make an excuse for missing it. She watched him not make one. "You understand the wind," Lenora said, standing. "I'll grant you that. But this is my ground, Mr. Vane, and I know it better than any man who walked in an hour ago. If we do anything to that wall, we do it knowing there's water under it." "Then we do it that way," Merritt said. She looked at him for a moment longer. Behind them, in the doorway, Maisie had come to the end of her milk and was holding the empty cup up with both hands, patient, the way a child holds a thing out to be filled by someone she has already decided will fill it. "The milk comes first," Lenora said, taking the cup. "Your claims can wait until morning. You have 7 days." She did not say where they would sleep. She only walked to the tack room door and opened it and stood aside, which was its own answer, and it was the answer Merritt had walked 30 miles to get. He had 7 days and no money and no materials but what the place held. He lay awake on the tack room floor that first night with Maisie against his chest and Tobin's back against his, and he thought about wet ground under a cold wall and how a man was supposed to prove anything about January in a week. In the morning he began the way he always began, which was to find out how bad it truly was before he touched a board. He worked the whole north wall with a spool of wool thread, tacking a thread across each crack and gap and watching it. Where the thread hung slack, the joint was tight. Where the thread snapped out level and stayed there, the wall was breathing. By the calving corner, nearly every thread stood straight out into the barn. Tobin followed him with Abram Quill's pencil and a scrap of board, and Merritt called out the joints, and the boy made a mark for each one that failed. It was the first job Merritt had given him. Tobin took it the way a hungry child takes anything offered, quick, as if it might be pulled back. Merritt lit a candle stub and set it on a shelf 6 feet in from the wall, in still air by any ordinary measure. He and Lenora stood and watched it. She opened the north door a hand's width. The flame did not flicker and gutter the way a flame does in a draft. It simply leaned, and then leaned harder, and then went out, all the way in the middle of the barn. "That's not a draft," Merritt said. "A draft you can chink, that's the whole wall pulling." Then he tested the ground, because she had been right about the ground, and he did not intend to be wrong about it twice. He poured a dipper of water at the base of the north sill and watched it stand in a bright skin instead of sinking. He lifted the bottom layer of the haystack and found it dark and matted where it met the floor. He drove an iron rod into the earth of the barn floor and marked with his thumb where it stopped, and the frost line was closer to the surface on the north side than the south, which meant cold was coming up out of the ground as well as in through the wall. "Your wall's bad," he told Lenora, "but your ground is why the wall can't win. You've got water sitting under the north side, and it freezes, and a frozen floor pulls heat out of everything that stands on it. A calf lying on that floor is being cooled from below and blown on from the side at the same time." "And your answer is what?" Lenora said. "Earth," Merritt said. "A bank of packed earth up the north side to take the wind before it reaches the boards, and a way to drain the ground so it stops freezing so hard so high." Lenora shook her head before he finished. "No, you don't pile dirt against my barn. My father built barns, and he never once put earth against green timber, and I've seen what it does. It rots the sill you're standing on right now trying to fix." "You're right that it would," Merritt said, "if I laid it against the boards. I don't mean to lay it against the boards." He was still explaining what he did mean. A crib to hold the earth off the wall, a gap between when Lenora stopped him with a look and walked to the northeast corner of the barn and pushed the hay away from the foundation with her boot. Under it lay a course of fieldstone, well cut and well set, running 6 or 8 feet along the base of the wall, and then stopping, unfinished, the last stone squared and waiting for the next that had never come. "Abram started that," she said. Her voice did not change, and that was how Merritt knew to be careful with it. "My husband. He found the rot in the sill 2 winters ago, and he started laying a stone toe to carry a bank off the wall. He had it in his head, whatever it was. He didn't get it out of his head onto paper before the wagon went over on him." Merritt crouched by the last stone. On its top face, faint under the dust, someone had scored a set of marks with a chisel, a line and a gap, and another line. 3 feet, Merritt said. He was leaving 3 feet between the bank and the wall. He looked up at her. He'd already solved the thing you're afraid of. He just didn't live to build it. Lenora looked at the stone for a while. "Then you'll build what he drew," she said, "and not one thing you can't show me a reason for." "Nothing I can't show you a reason for," Merritt agreed. He had 44 days until the cold Lenora feared most, the deep of January. He had 5 days left to earn the other 39, and he had a wet floor, a breathing wall, 2 draft horses, and a dead man's chisel marks telling him where to start. The blacksmith came out for Medora on the 2nd day of the earthwork because Lenora had sent word by a passing freighter that she needed a scraper edge built up and would pay in March. Ebner Foss was a square, unhurried man who looked at Merritt's slip scraper and then at Merritt's left hand and said nothing about either. He heated the iron edge and hammered it out true and hard-faced it where the old steel had worn thin. And when Lenora asked the price, he said he would take it in March like everything else, and not before. Then he told Merritt to write the amount down anyway. "You want it in your book," Ebner said, "not just in her memory and mine. A book doesn't argue in the spring." Merritt wrote it down. They hitched the two horses, Bishop and Penny, to the scraper and began to move the north basin into a bank. Merritt cut and drew, Lenora walked the team, and Tobin stood at the corner post and made a mark for every 10th load. The work was slow and cold and good. Merritt's left hand failed him twice an hour, and he looped a length of rope around the scraper handle and through his wrist, so the hand had only to hang there and not to grip. He did not mention it, and Lenora did not ask, but he saw her shorten the team's turn on his bad side so he would not have to reach across himself, and he understood that she had watched the hand and worked out its trouble without a word passing. He also, in his hurry, made his first true mistake. He drew the earth in fast against the barn to get a wall up before Lenora's 7th day, and he crowded the first loads right up to the boards, telling himself he would build the crib behind them once the trial was won. By the end of the day, the bank stood 4 feet against the north wall in a long, dark ridge, and it looked, in the failing light, like exactly the thing he had promised. Lenora walked the length of it before supper with a lantern. She stopped at the middle, crouched, and held the lantern to the lowest board of the barn where the earth met it. The board was dark. She pressed it with her thumb, and the thumb sank the smallest amount, and she stood up. "Stop the horses," she said. "We're a day from proof," Merritt said. "Give me the day." "Look at the board." He looked at the board. He knew what it meant. Earth against green timber, holding the wet in against the wall exactly the way he had told her that morning it would not. He had done in his hurry the one thing she had warned him against, and he had agreed not to do. Lenora did not say any of that. She took a shovel and drove it into her own bank and lifted the first load off the wall and threw it back down the slope. Then she stood holding the shovel and looked at him, and it was not anger in her face so much as a question about whether he was going to be a man who defended a wetboard or a man who moved it. Merritt took up the second shovel. "I was thinking about January," he said. "The barn has to live through April, too," Lenora said. They pulled 2 days of work back off the wall by lantern and by morning light, and when the boards were clear again, they laid the thing right. A separate crib of notched cottonwood logs, set 3 feet off the wall as Abram's chisel marks had said, open at both ends so air could pass, with a shallow stone-lined trench at the bottom to carry the melt away. The bank would bear against the crib and its own stone toe, and the crib would carry it, and the barn would stand free behind a running gap of cold air, dry. While they were clearing, Maisie fell asleep in an empty grain box in the corner of the barn, curled into it as if it were made for her. Lenora looked at her there for a moment. That evening, without saying why, she went up into the loft and brought down a cradle. It was Abram's work, most of it, the sides fitted, the joints clean, but the rockers had never been cut, so it sat flat and would not rock. She set it on the tack room floor, near where the children slept. "It's lower than the cot," Lenora said, to no one exactly. "She won't fall as far." Merritt looked at the tool marks in the wood, a dead man's marks, the same hand that had scored the stone. He did not touch them. He said only, "I'll cut her a pair of rockers when there's time," and Lenora nodded once and went into the fire, and that was all either of them said about it. They built the first section of crib and bank over the next days, and it protected exactly one calf pen, the worst one, in the corner where the wall breathed hardest. It was not the whole answer. It was a piece of the answer that Merritt could put a candle behind. On the 6th day, he did. Lenora opened the north door to a stiff gust. In the open pen beside the corner, the candle went out at once. In the protected pen, behind the finished crib, and its 3 feet of gap in its bank of earth, the candle bent and held, and stayed lit while the wind ran over the top of the bank and past the wall instead of through it. The barn was not much warmer. Merritt was careful to say so. "I haven't made you a warm barn," he told her. "I've made you one pen where the wind can't reach a calf to steal its heat. Do that to the whole north side and give the ground a way to drain, and you've got a barn a young thing can live in. That's all it is. It's not a stove." Lenora went to the shelf where Tobin's board of marks lay, the loads counted, the joints numbered, the candle test set down in the boy's careful hand under her own columns. She read down at once. Then she looked at Merritt. "You have your 44 days," she said. "Not 7. All of them." That night Tobin ate his supper, and then, out of the habit that had not yet left him, broke his cornbread and slid half of it up his sleeve for a tomorrow he did not trust. Lenora saw it, the way she saw most things. She did not speak to him about it. She only set a boiled potato on the shelf beside his bowl, not handed to him, just there, as though it had been counted into the meal from the start. When he tried to give it back, she did not take it. "That one was counted already," she said, and turned to the fire, and left him to decide what to do with the thing that was already his. The draft was beaten in one corner, but the floor was still wet, and the ground was still cold, and a beaten corner was a long way from a barn that could hold 11 late calves through the deep of January. Merritt lay awake again and thought about the ground. His answer to the ground was heat, and his first try at it was the worst mistake he made all winter. He had seen it done once, years back, on a wet-floored dairy, a deep pack of bedding and manure laid down thick so that the muck itself worked and warmed from inside and threw a slow heat up into the cold that came from below. He remembered the heat of it, and he wanted that heat, and he built for the heat and forgot everything that had made the heat safe. He laid the pack down wet. He forked in green willow slash for bulk and a heavy share of fresh manure to make it work fast, and he trod it down deep and tight to hold the warmth in, and he told himself the tighter he packed it, the more it would hold. He built it in 2 days and waited for it to come alive. It came alive wrong. By the second morning, the top of the pack was slick and dark, and when Merritt knelt on it, his knee came up wet. The center was warm, but only warm, not the deep working heat he remembered, because he had packed the air out of it, and a pack cannot work without air. And it stank. A hard, stinging reek of ammonia rose off it into the calving corner, and when Tobin crouched to make his marks, his eyes ran and he backed away rubbing them. Under the roof, where the warm, foul air met the cold boards, water had begun to bead and hang. That was the morning the inspector came. Fenwick Hale rode into the yard on a government horse, 58 years old, straight in the saddle, with a brass-case thermometer in a wooden box, and a reputation in the basin for being fair and hard to fool in the same breath. He was the territorial stock inspector, and he had heard, the way men hear things in a thin country, that the Quill widow had taken on a wandering carpenter who was burying her barn in dirt. He had come to see whether he would need to write anything down. He did not laugh at the earth bank. He walked it, and looked at the crib and the gap and the drain, and grunted, which from Fenwick Hale was nearer to respect than most men got. Then he came into the barn and knelt at the calving corner, at the height a newborn calf would lie, and stayed there, and his eyes began to water, and he stood up slowly. "Whose idea was the pack?" Hale said. Mine, Merritt said. Then hear this from a man who has buried more calves than you'll ever raise, Hale said, and he counted it on his fingers, not unkindly, the way a teacher counts. Earth against timber can rot your sill, though I see you've held it off the wall, so that's one thing you did right. A pack shut up tight, and wet makes moisture and makes ammonia and makes sick animals, and it can rot from the inside and turn on you. That reek at the floor would kill a calf's lungs before your wind ever got the chance. Your roof's sweating. You've traded a cold barn for a wet, foul, warm one, and the wet one kills faster. He looked at Merritt levelly. I don't believe your system will save those calves. Merritt did not defend the pack. He looked at the slick, stinking thing he had made, and he said the truest sentence he had in him. I made rot, he said, and called it heat. He looked back up at Hale. You shouldn't believe it, he said, not until it does. Lenora had already moved. She was herding the 2 calves that had been in the corner out into the aisle, into cleaner air, before anyone told her to. Then we take it out, she said. All of it, today. They stripped the wet pack out by dark wheelbarrow load after load and hauled it clear of the barn, and when the floor was bare again, Merritt built the pack the way it should have been built, which he only understood now that he had built it wrong. Dry chopped straw, deep. A share of dry sawdust for the air it held. Only a thin seam of old manure to start the work. No green slash, no wetting. Forked, not trodden. Turned every morning and evening so the air stayed in it. A clean, deep nesting layer kept dry on top for the calves to lie in. The water tubs moved off the pack entirely so no spillage soaked it. And Lenora, kneeling beside him with her sleeves back, remembered a thing her husband had done. Abram never stacked damp hay against the wall, she said. He kept a hand's width of air behind everything that could sweat. He said a thing has to be able to breathe out the wet, or it holds it against itself. She showed Merritt where to leave the gaps, and Merritt saw that she had handed him the last piece of the pack that he had not had, and that neither of them had the whole of it alone. Hale watched them rebuild it. He did not say it would work. When they were done, he opened his wooden box and screwed his brass thermometer into the end of a hollow reed, pushed the reed down into the new pack, waited, and read it, and wrote a number in his own book. Then he tore a clean page from that book and set it on the shelf beside Tobin's board. You'll keep readings, Hale said. Twice a day. Outside cold, barn cold, the heat down in that pack, whether the top's wet or dry, the wind, water pumped, hay fed, how the calves stand. He tapped the page. 4 weeks of it. I won't take a carpenter's word, and I won't take a widow's hope. I'll take numbers. If the numbers hold, I'll say so, and my saying so is worth something to a bank in March. If they don't, I'll say that too. That's fair, Lenora said. It's the only thing that is, Hale said, and rode out. The corrected pack was the right pack, but dry sawdust in that quantity had to be bought, 8 loads of it from the mill at Medora. And Blackwillow Fold had no money until March, and March had a $900 note against it already. The work through the middle weeks was a braid of 2 things that never quite let go of each other, the racing against the cold, and the slow knitting of 4 people into something that had not had a shape before. Merritt built the willow break out in the yard, a screen of willow bundles and split slat meant to stand off from the barn and slow the wind before it ever reached the earth bank, so the bank would not throw the wind into a hard drift right where the cattle had to walk. He set it 78 feet northwest of the barn, and he made it 9 feet tall, and he made it on the first try too good. He wove the willow tight because he was afraid of not enough, and a tight wall of willow is not a windbreak. It is a small cliff. He knew better. He had told other men better. He built it wrong anyway, out of the same fear that had made him pack the bedding tight. It was Tobin who gave him the words to see it. Merritt had the boy counting the gaps between the bundles, and he asked him, half to himself, whether he could see Lenora's red scarf through the wall where she stood on the far side. "I can see it," Tobin said. "Then the wind can see it too," Merritt said, and stopped, because that was exactly the thing that was wrong. He had woven the near section so tight the boy could barely find the scarf through it. "It's supposed to see it," he said. "Only slower. I built that piece to stop the wind. You can't stop it. You slow it, or it climbs over you and slams down harder on the other side." He would find out how right he was soon enough. For now he left the tight section standing because there was chinking to do and the light was going. The chinking was where Lenora repaid the pack lesson in kind. Merritt mixed his first batch heavy with the yellow clay off the north slope, because it was there and it was free, and he troweled it into the wall gaps thick and smooth and was pleased with it. It dried fast in the heat near the stove, and as it dried, it shrank, and by morning it had pulled itself away from the logs in a clean curl, useless, letting the wind straight back through. Lenora broke a fallen piece in her hand and showed him the smooth curved face where it had shrunk off the wood. "Yellow clay does that," she said. "It's greedy for itself. My father mixed it with river sand and chopped straw and a little horsehair, better than half sand, and it grips instead of shrinking. There's sand in the creek cut and horsehair off the curry comb." She was already gathering it. Merritt mixed the next batch to her father's recipe, more sand than clay, and it went on stubborn and stayed, and gripped the logs when it dried and held. They hung Elva's blue canvas curtain around the calving corner in those days, the heavy dairy curtain Elva had sewn that had ridden over Maisie on the cart. It made an inner baffle against the low drafts that slipped past everything else, hung so it stopped the wind at the floor but stayed open above head height so the barn could still breathe, and never nearer than 6 feet to a lantern or a stove, because Hale's warning about a curtain and a flame had gone in and stayed. Lenora ran her hand once along a line of Elva's stitching, small and even, the work of a careful woman she had never met, and she said nothing about it, which was its own kind of saying. Merritt cut the rockers for Abram's cradle one night when the other work was done, and fitted them, and left every one of Abram's own tool marks where they were. He set the finished cradle by the stove. In the morning there were 2 tin cups standing beside the stove instead of 1. Lenora had set them out. Neither of them said a word about the second cup. It was simply there, the way the potato had been counted, the way the milk came first, and it went on being there. The rival came while the willow brake was going up. Orson Treadwell rode down from the Red Spur, the largest outfit still standing in the basin, 51 years old, and carrying his 14 hired families' worth of certainty in the set of his shoulders. He had offered to buy Blackwillow Fold after Abram died and been refused, and he had not stopped believing that a widow alone would have to sell in the end, and that buying her out was a kindness as much as a want. He sat his horse and looked at the earth bank and the half-built willow wall, and at Merritt. "A hungry carpenter," Orson said, "has talked you into burying a barn." "He's my foreman," Lenora said, "until the work says otherwise." Orson's man Clay Pritch had ridden down with him, a freighter of 24 with a loud laugh and a habit of naming things. Clay looked at the long, dark ridge of earth along the north wall and grinned. "Merritt's burial mound," he said, and laughed, and the name stuck to the thing the way such names do. Merritt kept weaving willow. Tobin, at the far end of the break, went on counting gaps and marking his board, and Clay laughed again, softer, at a boy measuring a fence made of sticks. Before he left, Orson said the thing he had ridden down to say. "The weather turns bad this year. Everyone in the basin can feel it. My freight teams won't run the Basin Road once real winter's in. After the 23rd of December, I stop hauling. If you find yourself short of hay in January with the road shut, that's not a thing I can fix for you, and I won't send men and horses out in it to try." He turned his horse. The offer to buy stands until it doesn't. He rode off with Clay behind him, and the willow wall stood there in the yard looking, in the low sun, like a fine, strong thing. It had not yet met a real wind. It met one on the 20th of December, and so did everything else all at once. The first hard cold came down out of the northwest that day, 12 below, a stiff wind, 6 hours of blowing snow. Not the deep of January, not the thing Lenora feared, but the first honest test of everything they had built. And Merritt had said all along he wanted a test before January, so the barn could fail while there was still time to fix it. It failed in 3 places, and it held in more. It held where it mattered most. Behind the earth bank, in the crib, in the calving corner, the low wind did not reach the animals. The candle would have stayed lit. A calf born in the night to one of the early cows stood on its own legs inside the hour, dry in the deep, clean nesting straw. Warm enough. The pack down under the nesting layer held its heat above 100 degrees where Hale's thermometer read it, and the top of it stayed dry to the pressed palm. 2 fewer armloads of house firewood burned than on a like day the winter before, because no one had to keep coming in to thaw their hands from a barn full of wind. Lenora wrote all of it in her columns, and Tobin wrote the load counts and the temperatures in his, and the boy talked more that day than he had since he came, reading his own figures aloud, proud of them. And it failed. Behind the too tight section of willow, exactly where Merritt had feared not enough and built too much, the wind climbed the wall and dropped down hard on the other side and piled a ridge of snow across the very ground the cattle used, and one cow went down crossing it and had to be got up. The drain-back valve on the water line, a leather flap Merritt had trusted to empty the pipe after each pumping, stiffened in the cold and held just enough water to freeze the line solid, and one of the ridge shutter cords, meant to let the foul air out from inside, snapped in the cold and left the shutter jammed. Merritt wrote the 3 failures down himself, in his own hand, before he wrote anything else. "I missed 3 things," he said. Lenora read the page over his shoulder. "You promised to fix it," she said. "You never promised to guess right the first time." He cut every 4th bundle out of the tight willow section the next morning and lengthened the end so the wall would slow the wind and let it through instead of hurling it over. He pulled the leather drain flap and replaced it with a weighted wooden plug on a rope that a man could lift by hand to empty the line, so nothing had to be trusted to stay soft in the cold. He spliced the shutter cord and doubled it. Each failure had cost him something, and he paid it without a word of excuse, and the barn was better for every one of them, which was the whole idea of testing it in December. Hale came the next day and took the ledger away with him overnight. That was the hardest night. Lenora had learned to read the numbers herself by then, and she knew they were good, but good in her reading and good in the inspectors were not the same currency, and the currency that mattered was the one a bank would take in March. He brought it back the following afternoon and set it on the shelf. "The pack works below the top," Hale said. "The air cleared once you got the venting right, and it stayed clear. The draft's off the corner. That's real, and I'll write that it's real." He closed the book. "It's also 6 hours of 12 below. It is not 4 days of 40 below, which is what this basin does about once in a life, and what I think it means to do this year. Your system's promising, and it's unfinished. Don't let anyone, including yourself, tell you it's proven. It isn't. Not yet." "I know it isn't," Merritt said. Orson rode down that same afternoon, and this time he had come to press. He looked at the drifted snow behind the cut-down willow and at the frozen water line, and drew the conclusion a proud man draws, which is the one that suits him. Your fence throws snow on your own cattle and your waters froze, he said. I heard the carpenter's had his first hard day. I'll say again what I said. After the 23rd, I don't haul. Sell to me now, while the place is worth something, and you and the children winter warm in Medora instead of out here bedding a herd on a pile of dirt. No, Lenora said. Orson turned his horse. Then I hope your carpenter counted your hay right, he said, because it's all the hay you're going to get. When he was gone, Lenora looked at Merritt across the ledger. How long does the hay last? She said. If the road stays shut and the cold is as bad as Hale thinks. Merritt did the arithmetic he had done a dozen times already in his head, out loud this time so she could check it. Ordinary feeding. The stack ran 31 days. Fed heavy for severe cold, the way cattle have to be fed when they are burning themselves to stay alive. 26. 26 days, he said. Lenora took up Abram's pencil and drew a line through the old easy ration figures at the top of the page and wrote the harder number under it. Then we prepare for 26, she said. Outside, over the northwest rim of Knifegrass Basin, the color was going out of the sky. Not clouding, clearing, the hard, bright, empty clearing that older men in that country had learned to be afraid of. The sky that comes down after the snow instead of before it. Far out in the south pasture, a cow that had been grazing lifted her head and turned herself square round tail to the northwest, to a wind that had not yet reached the ranch at all. The first test had found 3 weaknesses in a day. The real cold was still coming, and it would have 4 days to find the rest. The days after the 23rd narrowed down to a single question, and everyone at Blackwillow Fold learned to hold it without saying it. Whether 26 days of hay and 1 winter's worth of fixes would be enough for a cold that no living man in the basin had a match for. They prepared. There was nothing else to do with the waiting but turn it into work. Prudence Vale rode over on the 5th of January with eggs and a jar of preserves to trade for milk, and with news, because news traveled the thin homesteads faster than any freighter. The telegraph at the Medora office had a warning off the wire from beyond Bismarck. Temperatures falling hard and fast, a front dropping down out of the north country with nothing behind it but more of the same. She had seen ravens working close in around the buildings that morning, which the old people said meant they had given up on the open ground, and her own cattle and Lenora's had all through the day been turning to stand tail to the northwest, the way stock do when they feel a thing in the air that men need instruments to find. My father used to get a headache before the worst of them, Prudence said, pulling her scarf back up. Said the air went thin in his skull. He had one this morning. She looked at the clearing sky and did not like it. You've a great deal of dirt piled up out here, Lenora. I hope to God it was worth the digging. So do I, Lenora said. They filled both interior water tanks to the brim off the well, so that whatever the outside pump did, there would be 3 days of water standing inside the barn. Merritt drained the outside line with the new wooden plug and left the handle wrapped. Tobin painted the numbers on the guide stakes with lamp black mixed into milk so they would take to cold, wet wood. 1 number to a stake, big enough to find by touch under a glove if it came to that. Maisie was given the job of tearing narrow strips off the frayed lower edge of Elva's blue curtain. Only the edge, only the part already going. And they tied a blue strip to every 3rd stake, so a man half blind in a whiteout could see the flag before he could read the number. Abram's survey stakes made the spine of it. Merritt had found 24 of them bundled under the loft stairs, each with Abram's axe mark cut into the head, and Lenora had not wanted them used at first. They were a dead man's stakes cut by a dead man's hand for work he never did. But she came around to it, because they were straight and true and already sharpened, and because there was a rightness in Abram's stakes being what held the line between the house and the barn he had died before he could finish protecting. They drove the old stakes for the house to barn run and the new ones on toward the pump and the willow brake, a numbered rope and stake road across a yard that would soon have no other landmark in it. Merritt packed the repair satchel and made Tobin watch him do it so the boy would know what was in it. Coil of rope, mallet, rawhide lashings, knife, a fist of nails, a small hand auger for boring green wood. He buckled it shut with Elva's waxed strap, the one that had held the cart, because the strap held where ordinary rope had a way of working loose in the cold. "Why do we need the rope and the stakes both?" Tobin asked. "If we've got the rope." "A rope keeps a man from drifting," Merritt said. "The stakes tell him whether he's still going somewhere. A man can hold a rope and walk in a circle all night and freeze doing it. The numbers are how you know you're getting closer to a door instead of farther from one." He had Tobin walk the whole line once with his eyes shut, hand over hand along the rope, calling the numbers as his glove found each stake, until the boy could do it without a hitch. That evening, before the fire, Lenora set a pair of dry gloves on the bench by Merritt's coat, where his cold hand would find them in the morning without asking. She did not say anything about it. A day later, Merritt set a pair of dry socks by hers, in the same place, in the same silence. It had become the whole language of the thing between them, this leaving of dry things where a cold hand or foot would find them, and neither of them reached for any other words, and neither of them seemed to want to. The snow began on the evening of the 7th, before Merritt had driven the last stake toward the pump. The black frost came in the order the old men feared most, the snow first, and then the cold behind it. For the first night and into the second it snowed hard with the wind still climbing, heavy wet flakes at first, and then finer and drier as the air chilled, until the yard was gone, and the willow brake was a gray suggestion, and the barn was a shape you found by the rope and not the eye. The willow brake bent to it and did its work. Slowed and split by the porous wall, the wind laid its drift out wide and downwind instead of packing it hard against the barn, and the low sweep of it went up and over the earth bank instead of into the calving corner. The cattle in the corner stood out of the wind. Powder found one seam of chinking that had a weak spot and drove a fan of snow through it fine as flour, and Tobin found it by the cold thread of it on his cheek and packed it from the inside with a fresh handful of Lenora's sand-heavy mix, working it in with his thumb the way he had watched Merritt do, and it held. Late on the first night, one of the late cows went down into labor 20 days before Lenora had looked for her, and the storm had 4 people and a barn full of stock, and now a calving to hold all at once, and it had only begun. The wind came into its full strength on the second day. It rose past 50 miles an hour, and it took the yard entirely down, not dimmed the yard, erased it, so that a man 3 feet from the barn wall could not see the wall. The temperature, which had held in the teens below while it snowed, began to drop the way Prudence's wire had promised, past 25 below, and still falling, the snow gone dry as sand and driving level. Out in that, north of the Willow Brake, Clay Pritch's freight sled went over. He should not have been on the Basin Road at all. He had run one last load for the Red Spur, gambling on beating the worst of it back, and the worst of it had not waited. The sled caught a buried cut and rolled, and one of the team went down with a leg broken under the traces, screaming in a way Clay would hear for a long time after, and Clay cut the horses loose because there was nothing else to do, and he could not save the one and would not leave the other tied to it. Then he stood in a white roar with no building anywhere in it, and understood that he was going to die within sight of ranches he had hauled to for years and could not find. Then, low and to his left, close to the ground, something blue snapped in the wind. Clay went to it on his hands and knees because he could no longer stand into the wind, and it was a strip of blue cloth tied to a stake. And cut into the head of the stake under the cloth was an axe mark, and painted on it in lamp black was a number he could just read. 17. He did not know what 17 meant. He knew only that a number meant a man had put it there, and that stakes with numbers led somewhere. And he crawled to the next flag, and it was 14, and the one after was 11, and he understood he was counting down toward something, and he made himself believe the next stake was there each time before he could see it. Inside the barn, over the wind, Tobin heard a sound that did not belong to the storm. A steady metal knock, a buckle striking wood coming closer. He told Merritt. Merritt and Lenora went out together on the guide rope, she anchoring, he reaching, and they found Clay Pritch half buried against stake 9, past crawling, and dragged him in between them. They laid him behind Elva's blue curtain by the stove, where the barn was warmest and the flame was safely off from the cloth, and Lenora worked his boots off and his frozen coat while Merritt rubbed the blood back toward his hands. When Clay could hold his eyes open, Maisie came and stood in front of him and held out her own tin milk cup, the small one, gravely, the way she held things out to be filled and now to be given. Clay reached for it, and his hands would not close on it. Tobin, without a word and without making anything of it, steadied the bottom of the cup so the man could drink, the same boy whose fence of sticks Clay had laughed at from a saddle a month before. Clay drank, and when he could talk, he told them the thing he had seen on his way down through the storm, the last useful thing before the cold took his voice for a while. The northwest end of the willow brake had been working loose, a lashing gone, the end of the wall starting to walk in the wind. That was the worst news he could have brought, because the loose end lay out past the farthest safe stake, and the barn still had a calving to get through before anyone could go and see to it. The cow that had gone down the first night could not finish. When Lenora got her arm in, she found the calf turned wrong, backward, hind feet presenting, the hardest birth there is, and no time in the world to be having it. This was hers to do, and everyone in the barn knew it. Merritt knew carpentry and wind and water. He did not know this. He held the lantern and the cow and did exactly what Lenora told him, and nothing she did not. She tied the calf's hind legs with a loop of soft rope. She waited out the cows straining, feeling for the moment between, and in that moment she brought the calf, easing it, turning with it, not pulling against the cow, but with her, until it came in a rush into the straw. And it lay there and did not breathe. Then the four of them did the thing they had each learned a piece of. Lenora cleared the airway. 2 fingers, a sweep, the trick of it in her hands from 100 spring calvings. Merritt took the calf by the hind legs and swung it once to clear the lungs, and then went at its chest with a fistful of dry sacking. Hard. The drying that Elva had taught him mattered more than any warmth, because a wet calf in that cold was a dead calf, and Elva had always said warmth without dryness only moved the danger from the skin to the lungs. Tobin ran the warmed cloth from where it hung by the stove and back. Clay, barely an hour from dying in the snow himself, sat up against the wall and held the lantern high and out away from the blue curtain, minding the flame without being told, because he had heard Hale's warning repeated enough to know it. And Maisie, too small to help and too stubborn to be kept back, put her small fingers on the calf's ear and left them there, because that was what she had seen Merritt do, checking the ear the way Elva checked a wrist, and no one moved her hand away. The calf coughed. It drew one shuddering breath and then another, and its head came up, and Lenora lifted it and set it deep into the dry nest in the corner where the wind could not reach it, and pushed a share of warm colostrum into it, and it lived. No one said anything, There was nothing that needed saying, and the storm was too loud for it anyway. But it was every fix at once that had kept that calf alive. The wind kept off the corner, the deep, dry bedding. The air kept clean by the venting hail had forced on them. The blue curtain holding the low draft. The water and warm milk held in reserve inside where the cold could not get at it. Not one thing. All of them, and the four of them, and a dead woman's habit carried in a 3-year-old's fingers. Then Merritt smelled the change, and looked up, and saw the roof beginning to sweat. Steam was starting to hang under the ridge, warm bodies and warm berth water, and the working pack were putting moisture into the air faster than it could leave, and the reason it could not leave was that the leeward ridge vent, the one hail had made them swear never to close, had been sealed from the outside by driven snow. If it stayed sealed, the barn would turn wet, and a wet barn at 40 below would kill everything in it more surely than any wind. The vent had to be opened. Opening it meant going outside, into the third night of the black frost, in the dark, in the worst of it. And the willow brake's loose end was out there too, walking in the wind, ready to bring the whole north side of the barn down to the wind if it let go. By the third night, it was 48 below, and the wind was over 50, and the world outside the barn had stopped existing. Merritt tied the guide rope around his waist and put the other end into Lenora's hands. She did not do the thing he expected, which was to brace it against the stove post. She took the rope around her own waist first, and then around a barn column, so that if she lost her feet, the column would hold, and not the stove, and so that it was her own body, and not a post between him and the wind. It was the better anchor, and they both knew it in the half-second it took, and neither said so. He went out along the rope toward the willow brake, stake by stake, calling the numbers. Though no one could hear him, going to the sound of it more than the sight. He got the vent open first, reaching up under the eave, and clearing the packed snow out of the leeward shutter with the mallet handle, until he felt the barn breathe out past his hand, the held wet air going up and out into the cold, where it could do no harm. Then he went on to the willow brake, and that was where it nearly ended. A gust came that was more than the rest, and it tore the repair satchel off his shoulder, and the ordinary shoulder rope parted in the cold like burnt string. The bag went, and with it the mallet and the auger and the lashings, everything he needed to save the wall, gone 12 feet off into the white and as good as gone to the far side of the earth. Except that Elva's wax strap, the strap he had buckled around the bag, had caught and hooked itself over the head of one of Abram's stakes, and it held, stretched bar tight in the wind, a dark line in all that white, the one thing out there that a man could see and go to. Merritt went to it on his belly. His bad left hand had already stopped closing in the cold, and he had looped the mallet cord around that wrist so the hand only had to hang in it. Ice had sealed one eye shut. A willow post, torn loose, swung out of the white and struck him across the shoulder and put him down flat, and for a long moment he lay in the snow with the wind trying to bury him, and did not get up. Inside, the rope in Lenora's hands went slack. All the way slack. She stood braced against the column with a dead rope in her fists and no way to know if the slack meant he was down or he was gone. The rope jerked once, then nothing. Lenora did not pull him in. Pulling a man off his feet in that wind could kill him as fast as the cold. She held, and she waited, with Tobin's hands over hers now on the rope, and she counted her own breaths and made herself wait through them. Out at the break, Merritt got up. He reached the strap and hauled the bag in by it, hand over frozen hand, and he reached the failed lashing, and he saw at once that he could not rebuild the wall as it had been. There was no time and no feeling left in his hands to weave willow in the dark. So he did the thing that a man does when he cannot win, which is to lose the smallest piece on purpose. He cut the loose upper section of the brake away entirely and let the wind have it, so it would stop hammering the post to pieces. He bored a hole through the one sound post that was left with the auger, threaded Elva's strap through the hole for his first firm hold, and lashed the standing lower section fast to it with the two rawhide ties. And then, instead of trying to seal the wall solid against the wind, he cut one panel open so the wind could bleed through the gap instead of building against it and throwing it all down. Let it through, slower. The thing he had known all along and kept having to learn. He gave the rope 3 hard pulls, the signal they had set, and felt Lenora brace and answer, and he came back down the line stake by stake to the barn door and fell through it, and Lenora and Tobin dragged it shut against the wind behind him. He could not talk for a while. When he could, he said the only report there was. "It'll hold till morning." Lenora was working the ice off his sealed eye with the warmth of her own thumb, and his frozen glove off the hand that would not open. She did not look up from it. "Morning is enough," she said. Morning came, as it does even after a night like that, and it was still and blinding and 48 below, and no one yet knew what had lived through it beyond the barn walls. They counted it as the light came up. 27 grown cattle alive, 11 late calves alive, the backward one weak but nursing. Every person accounted for, Clay Pritch among them, stiff and frostbitten at the fingers but breathing. Against that, the failures, the outside waterline frozen solid, one ridge shutter torn, one willow section cut away and gone, 2 boards of the north wall split by the pressure of the drift, one drainage slot at the base of the bank sealed with packed snow, 3 of the 26 hay sections eaten ahead of schedule to hold the cattle's heat through the worst of the cold. Merritt wrote the failures into the ledger first, above the count of the living. Tobin watched him do it and asked why the bad went at the top. "A weakness shouldn't be let to hide behind a success," Merritt said. "The wall held." "Good. Now, where didn't it? Write that down where you can't help but read it, or next winter it kills you while you're busy being proud of the part that worked." Hail came when the road opened 3 days on, and he read the whole ledger before he would so much as look at a calf. He read every page of it, the failures and the fixes, and the twice-a-day numbers through all 4 nights, and only then did he go down the row of pens. He smelled the bedding at the height a calf lay in it. He pressed the dry upper layer with his flat hand and turned the palm up clean. He dug the packed snow out of the sealed drain slot and looked up under the bank at the crib and the gap. He put his thermometer down into the pack and read the core. He set the calves' condition against the feed Lenora had recorded and against her own accounts from winters before. Then he stood in the aisle and gave his judgment, and he was careful with it, because a careful judgment was the only kind worth anything from Fenwick Hale. "The bank took the wind off the low wall," he said. "The willow spread the drift till the end of it let go, and letting that end go on purpose was the right call, not a failure. You sacrificed a piece to save the whole, and I'll write it that way. The dry nest and getting to the calves fast the minute they dropped, that saved more of them than any heat did. Your pack helped. It kept the ground from turning to a slab of ice under the straw. It was never the furnace some fool would have claimed it was, and you never claimed it, and that's why I believe the rest of your book." He closed it. "No single thing here saved this herd. That's exactly why it can be done again by someone else, somewhere else, out of a book instead of out of luck. One clever trick you can't hand to a neighbor, this you can." He wrote his finding on the inspector's line at the back of the ledger, and Merritt saw that he did not write it under Merritt's name. He wrote, "System developed at Blackwillow Fold by Lenora Quill and Merritt Vane," and he handed it back open to that page, so they would both see it, and said nothing more about it because Fenwick Hale said things once. Clay Pritch mended over those days by the stove, and when his fingers would work again, The first thing he did was go out and repair the blue markers the storm had torn, and drive a new stake 17 with his own hands, where the old one had stood, the stake his life had turned on. He found Tobin's ledger, the boy's own board of marks, and where he had once made the whole crew call the earthbank Merritt's burial mound. He took the pencil and drew a line through the words burial mound in the margin, and wrote above them, in a freighter's rough hand, North Shoulder. I saw the cloth, was all Clay would say about the night, to anyone who asked, and he did not say it as though it were much. After that, I only had to believe the next stake was there. Orson Treadwell came last of all, when the roads were open and the count was in from every outfit in the basin, and his count was bad. The Red Spur had lost 4 late calves in a corner of its own calving shed roof, its better stocked, better built, prouder shed that had trusted its size to see it through, and had stood square into the wind and let the wind win. Orson rode into the yard at Blackwillow Fold with mud and old snow to his knees and his hat in his hand, and he did not apologize, because men like Orson do not have apology in them, and it would have been a lie if he'd tried. He asked the only question that stood in for one. He looked at the long bank of earth he had watched a hungry carpenter pile against a barn, and he asked Merritt, which spillway failed? Meaning the willow, meaning show me the weak place, meaning teach me, meaning I was wrong, all of it folded into 3 words a proud man could get out without breaking. Merritt did not answer him. He pointed at Lenora. She knows where the water goes. Merritt said, it's her ground. It always was. And Orson Treadwell, who had come 3 times to buy this woman's land out from under her because he could not imagine her keeping it, took his hat the rest of the way off, and turned to Lenora Quill and waited to be taught. She led him down the north side of the barn, and showed him the crib, and the gap, and the drain, and the bank, and where the drift had sealed the slot, and how they would open the far end next year so it could not, and Orson listened, and once he crouched to put his own hand up under the bank to feel the running gap of cold air that kept the wall dry, and he stayed crouched there a moment longer than he needed to. The ranch had lived through January, but the note for $900 still came due in March, and living through January did not by itself pay it. It was the ledger that paid it, in the end, or made the paying possible. Lenora rode to Medora with Hale's finding written in the back of it, and the whole winter's numbers in front, and she showed the bank not a widow's hope, but a stock inspector's signed judgment, and 11 living calves where the whole basin had buried its young that winter. A calf crop come through whole, in the year the northern plains lost more cattle than it could count, was worth more standing than most men's herds were worth at all. The bank extended the note against the spring sale. Merritt was in none of that. It was Lenora's name on the paper, and Lenora's word that carried it, and that was as it should be. When she came back, they did the other thing, the thing that mattered more than the note, and that neither of them had put into words yet. Merritt did not ask her for wages as foreman, though she offered them. Wages, he said, would leave the children living on her goodwill and nothing sure, and if he died in some other winter, a foreman's dead children had no claim on anything. So they drew a partnership instead, at the kitchen table in the ledger's own hand. Lenora kept the land that had been Abram's, outright and always. Merritt earned a defined share of the ranch over 5 years of proven labor, entered in the book like everything else, and set above both their portions, ahead of the land and the share and the note and all of it, one plain clause: Tobin Vane and Maisie Vane hold permanent residence at Blackwillow Fold, regardless of what passes between the undersigned adults. The children had a home that no death and no falling out could take from them. That came first, before any question of what the 2 grown people were to each other, because the children came first. That was the whole shape of the man, and Lenora had known it since he walked toward her barn instead of her house. "I'm not giving you what was Abram's," Lenora said when the clauses were set. "I never asked you to," Merritt said, and closed the book. Lenora opened it again and slid it back across the table to him, to the line where his name went. "I'm naming what you already carried," she said. He signed it with Abram's pencil. That night there were 2 full cups by the stove, as there had been for weeks. Merritt stood by the fire and said, "I can stay till the snow's gone." Lenora put a length of wood on the fire. "Stay till the grass comes back." Merritt looked through the doorway to the small room off the kitchen, the room Abram had finished and never used, where Maisie was asleep in Abram's cradle, with the rockers Merritt had cut, breathing slow. "Longer than that," he said. There was no kiss, and there were no more words. Lenora moved the second cup a little nearer his hand on the shelf, which was the whole of her answer, and it was enough, and they let the fire have the rest of the evening. The reconciliation, such as it was, happened the way everything real happened at Blackwillow Fold, through work and not through speeches. Orson sent his hands down through the last of the winter to help rebuild the willow brake wider and looser than before, and came himself and learned to set a bankstone with the uphill face turned in the way Lenora showed him, and asked her which face turned uphill the first time, as if the question cost him nothing, though it cost him plenty. Clay drove the wagons that hauled the new willow. The basin's other ranchers, who had lost so much, came to read the ledger for themselves and to walk the north shoulder and to carry the method home to their own barns, because a thing you could carry home in a book was worth more to a broken country than any one miracle. By May, the grass had come back over the long slope of the earth bank, so that from a distance it looked less like a thing built against the barn than like the land itself had risen up to shelter it. The drainage slot ran open at both ends now. The willow brake stood with more air between its branches than Merritt had first dared to leave, having learned, in the worst way, that a wall you can see through is stronger than a wall you cannot. Inside, on clean, dry straw, the calves that had no business being alive slept in a row. They married in May, beside the rebuilt north wall, with the grass green over the shoulder behind them. Hale came, and Prudence, and Dr. Mercy Wren from Medora, with a small cake and a private nod at the old harness strap she recognized as Elva's stitching. Clay stood up beside Tobin. Orson did not come to the wedding. It was not in him to stand and watch, and he knew it, but sometime in the night before he left a fresh bundle of 24 new survey stakes leaning against the barn beside Abram's worn old ones, cut and sharpened, without a word or a mark to say who left them. Lenora wore no fine dress. She wore a narrow sash of Elva's blue canvas, mended with new thread, and Merritt signed the marriage record with Abram's pencil, and neither of those things needed explaining to anyone who had wintered there. Tobin had stopped hiding bread in his sleeve somewhere back in the deep of the cold, and had not started again. He believed in tomorrow now the way a boy ought to, without thinking about it, which is the only way that counts. Maisie let go of the edge of Abram's cradle one spring morning and took 3 unsteady steps across the kitchen floor toward Lenora with her arms up and said, "Ma," plainly, as though it had always been the word. Tobin was older, and it was harder for him, and he waited until no one seemed to be looking his way. Then he said it low, half a question, testing whether the ground would hold his weight. "Ma Lenora?" Lenora did not answer him with a word. She took his hand, his cold hand, and turned it over and pressed 2 fingers to the inside of his wrist, feeling for the cold there, the way Elva Vane had always felt a child's wrist before she felt anything else, a habit that had come to Lenora across the winter without either of them ever naming it, passed hand to hand like the tin cups and the dry gloves and the blue cloth. "No," Lenora said. "Your glove's still wet." She took the wet glove off him and put a dry one on in its place. That was her answer, and Tobin understood it, because it was the only kind of answer anyone at Blackwillow Fold ever gave to the things that mattered most. Blackwillow Fold did not live through the black frost because a wall stopped the wind. No wall stopped that wind. One lashing broke, one valve froze, one pack rotted before it was rebuilt, one batch of chinking pulled loose off the logs. The place lived because every one of those weaknesses was found and made to answer for itself before the deep of January came, while there was still time to fix it, and because when the worst of it came, neither Merritt nor Lenora held on to being right about it alone. He knew the wind. She knew the ground. Neither of them could have kept a calf alive that third night by himself, and both of them had spent too long believing that being alone was the same as being strong. Out past the barn, the grass stood green over the shoulder of turned earth, and the drainage gap ran open at both ends, and the willow let the wind through slower than it wanted to go. Inside, beside the kitchen stove, stood two full-sized tin cups. Between them stood one smaller cup. Maisie had put it there herself, and no one had moved it.